Hi guys, my name is Nick Toon, and today I will be talking about why Gandhi should be seen for his successes and his failures. So before we get started and get into the main details of the discussion, I'm just going to talk about his early life real quick. So Gandhi was born in Porbandar, India in 1869. His father was the chief minister in Porbandar and other territories as well. His mother was very religious, which carried on with Gandhi himself as a child and through his adult years. And as a child, Gandhi was actually very timid, very shy, but he eventually, grew out of that at some point. And then finally, he studied law in London in England. So to begin with his accomplishments, after his career in India didn't work out so well, in 1893 he sailed down to South Africa to continue his work as a lawyer. He immediately faced discrimination by the British and by the Boer population over there. But before he did too much about that, he, especially during the outbreak of the Boer War, he raised an ambulance corps to assist the British during said war. And his whole mentality in that was, if I'm going to fight against, or if I'm going to, advocate for Indian independence against the British back in India, then I should help them out here in South Africa while I can. And so he did that, and after the Boer War, he did begin to advocate for Indians in South Africa, which successfully secured the state-recognized Hindu marriages in South Africa, as well as getting rid of the poll tax for Indians. So he immediately, or not immediately, but soon after his advocacy, he did begin to see some success, especially in nonviolent and peaceful protest. And then afterward, after his two decades, I believe, in South Africa, he returned to India and he began to lead peaceful protests against the British government in India as well in 1919, even though they sometimes turned violent. For instance, one event was the British ended up using machine gun fire against Indian protesters, and as a result, about 400 Indians died in the aftermath. And so, as you can see, even in the midst of all this, the violence that did happen sometimes during his protests, Gandhi still committed to using nonviolent and peaceful protests to achieve his goals, which ended up working in his favor. One of his most famous acts of defiance against the British government was the Salt March in 1930. The British had just recently passed tax acts which put really heavy taxes on salt in India, and so in defiance of this, Gandhi, along with dozens of his followers and supporters, marched over 200 miles, I believe it was, to the Arabian Sea to collect salt themselves, which did actually end up bringing some positive benefits to the local population around the Arabian Sea. And then finally, after several more years of this kind of advocacy, Gandhi did help India become independent in 1947. But India was split between India and Pakistan, which with Pakistan being mostly Muslim, India being mostly Hindu. So the negative consequences of that decision can still be seen today, as India and Pakistan are not friendly neighbors by any stretch of the imagination. And then to get started with some of his faults, while these faults didn't really necessarily affect his advocacy, they can still be kind of seen as knocks against his moral character. So we'll go ahead and get started. So early on in his career, Gandhi was actually racist, and I have evidence to back that up. While in South Africa, he wrote that the native South Africans are troublesome, very dirty, and live like animals. He also wrote that the white South Africans should be the predominating race, and so in response to that, Gandhi's biographer himself, Ramachandra Guha is his name, he said that Gandhi believed the ideas of his time and of his culture, and that whites were the most civilized, followed by Indians, and with Africans dead last. And so, obviously, in today's standard, that would not pass by any stretch of the imagination. However, for his time, it was a little more normal, and while that still doesn't justify it, Gandhi did eventually grow out of that mindset, and he did eventually fight for the equality of all people, regardless of skin color. And then his other fault is that in Gandhi's late 70s, he slept naked with his teenage grandniece to test his willpower to abstain from sex. And so this can be, I believe it can be seen as a form of potential pedophilia, obviously, because, well, first off, he was 70 and his grandniece was a teenager in her late teens. Additionally, incest as well. However, it's not completely clear if he did actually engage in activity with his grandniece. But regardless of whether that even happened, I believe we can all agree that this was not morally acceptable by any means at all. But regardless of what the result of that was, the main takeaway that we can take from Gandhi's life, from his accomplishments and his faults, is recognize that he did have faults. Especially the most notable of them all was his early racism, early on in his career. He outgrew this racism. He learned from his own mistakes, from this mistake, that he was wrong to think that, and he eventually became one of the most well-known advocates of human rights in the 20th century and modern history. I think we could all agree on that. He eventually advocated for equality of all people, and I think it's safe to say that he learned from his earlier mistake when he was not advocating for Africans as well. He was very successful in his efforts to make India independent, and he's also known as India's primary leader in gaining independence. So obviously he was very, well known and successful in what he did. His methods of protesting, of peaceful protesting, eventually were adopted by Martin Luther King Jr. to be used for the civil rights for African Americans in the United States as well in the 1960s. And his methods were used by other people as well throughout the world. Ultimately, we should celebrate him for his successes while learning from his failures and his mistakes, just like he did. I believe this mindset, this mentality can be applied to all aspects, to all figures in history. We have our founding fathers, we have Columbus, we have military leaders, so on and so forth, countless examples of people that are very well known for what they contributed to society, to our country, and even to the world. But they also had their faults. They also had their weaknesses. And some of them were worse than others, obviously. But I think we can look past those in a way, learn from their mistakes, and celebrate their successes just like they did, just like they learned from their own mistakes. And that's why I believe it should be applied to all people. If it can be applied to Gandhi and we can still celebrate him, I think the same thing can be applicable to other historical figures as well. And that's all I have for you today, but thank you for watching my presentation.